Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to our Data Plus Diversity event. It's a series that we have that looks at different conversations related to diversity and data. This is actually our third one this month. It's been a really awesome Black History Month, and I'm excited to kick this one off specifically around the Tuskegee Airmen. For everyone, I'm Sedale. I am very fortunate to be on Tableau's Community Equity Task Force. My day job is the Director of Digital Insights at a company called Purple in the DC area. I also lead a Tableau user group, the Analytics Tableau user group as well. This particular talk, though, as I mentioned about the Tuskegee Airmen, just for your awareness, this is a group of primarily African-American pilots that flew in World War II. I'll leave the rest for our renowned historian, Dr. Haulman, to talk about, but wanted you to know kind of how we got to this point. Dr. Haulman will be our first speaker, and then we'll spend most of our time talking about the Tuskegee Airmen Challenge, which most of you are aware of, was a challenge we kicked off earlier this month. We reviewed a lot of different visualizations. We'll talk through a few of them today, but we're really blown away by all of the different submissions, both in Tableau, the Tidy Tuesday on Twitter team, and all the different people that created visualizations in R as well. So appreciate everyone that participated. A couple of quick housekeeping things. This will be recorded. I think you can see on the screen it's actually being recorded, and Tableau will put it out on the YouTube page. So if you miss it or you want to see something else, that's the best way to get it. Also, if you have just comments, you want to let us know where you're calling in from, you just want to say how cool the visual is, feel free to use the chat. But if you have a specific question, right next to the chat is a button called Q&A, and that's how we'll track all of the questions for either for Dr. Haulman or for the reviewers of the different visualizations. I think those are my big, just so you know who all is here. We also have the leaders of the Veterans Advocacy Club, who's really been the driving force behind this chat, and also advocates for veterans in our as well. So we thanks to Tim and Ethan for joining. Alan is here as well, who is a part of the Du Bois Challenge and one of the partners for the Tuskegee Airmen Challenge. With that, I'm going to go to Dr. Haulman. Dr. Haulman is an Air Force historian, writer, and teacher who's written many books focused on the Tuskegee Airmen. He retired in 2019, but spends a lot of his time educating us around this topic. He was formerly at the Air Force Historical Research Agency as the Chief of Organizational History Division, but spends all of his time now educating us all about the Tuskegee Airmen. We got to speak just before this, and he's been quite busy with various talks on his paper and his work. So we're really happy to have Dr. Haulman here to speak with us today. And so with that, Dr. Haulman, I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Sedale, and I appreciate this opportunity to share what I've learned about the Tuskegee Airmen over the years. Much of what I've learned about them, I discovered while working, as you mentioned, as a historian at the Air Force Historical Research Agency, where I worked for 37 years. Almost all of those years as a historian, and the last 13 years of my time there, I was served as head of the Organizational Histories Branch. And the Organizational Histories Branch of the Air Force Historical Research Agency holds the unit histories of all the Air Force organizations over the years, including the histories of Tuskegee Airmen organizations. Next slide, please. The Air Force Historical Research Agency, for those of you who don't already know, is the primary repository of official documents related to Air Force units, such as those to which the Tuskegee Airmen belong. For example, the 332nd Fighter Group, the 99th Fighter Squadron, and so on. The agency houses such documents as unit histories and mission reports, orders that award various honors, some personal papers, some oral histories, and other documents related to Air Force history. Next slide, please. No African Americans were allowed to serve in the Army or the Navy as pilots until 1941, when the Tuskegee Airmen story began. There were a few African American military pilots before 1941, but they served in the air forces of other nations. For example, Eugene Bullard, who you see pictured, flew for the French Air Service during World War I. He was not allowed to serve in the American Air Service after the United States entered war on the French side. Next slide, please. In 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was running for an unprecedented third term as president. He promised to train African Americans as military pilots in the Air Service, in the Air Corps, and he fulfilled his promise in 1941 when the first Black flying unit was activated by the War Department. It was the 99th Pursuit Squadron, activated at Chanute Field in Illinois in March of 1941. That squadron soon moved to Tuskegee, where its pilots were trained. Next slide, please. Tuskegee was chosen as the place for many reasons. One was its southerly climate. Its southern climate allowed more days of good flying weather. Civilian pilots were already being trained at Tuskegee Institute through the civilian pilot training program that was held at other places around the country. Tuskegee Institute also lobbied to be the place where the military flight training for Blacks would take place. Eleanor Roosevelt visited the airfield at Tuskegee Institute in March of 1941, where civilian Black pilots were already being trained. And this photograph of Eleanor Roosevelt in a Piper Cub was taken at Tuskegee Institute's airfield. It wasn't the airfield that was used later for primary flight training for the Tuskegee Airmen or for the basic and advanced flight training for the Tuskegee Airmen. Next slide, please. This is a picture of a PT-13 or PT-17 airplane, the type of airplane that was used for the primary flight training at Moton Field. Moton Field was built specifically for Tuskegee Institute to carry on primary flight training for the Army Air Forces under contract. Military flight training took place in 3 phases: primary, basic, and advanced. And each of those phases took from 9 to 10 weeks. The primary flight training took place in planes like this and the PT-19, which was a monoplane. The only difference between the PT-13 and the PT-17 is the engine, so it's hard to tell exactly which kind this plane is. Moton Field had no paved runways. It had turf runways or grass. And it's now the location of the Tuskegee Airmen National Historic Site and the Tuskegee Airport. Most of the flight instructors at Moton Field during World War II were Black civilians like Chief Charles Anderson. Chief was a nickname for him. He's the one you saw in the previous picture who was taking Eleanor Roosevelt up for a flight. Next slide, please. After primary flight training at Moton Field, cadets moved to a much larger airfield several miles northwest of Moton Field. It was called Tuskegee Army Airfield. It was not owned by Tuskegee Institute, and it was owned by the Army Air Forces. You can see it had 4 large paved runways. It was a very large base because it was the only base in the country where Black military pilots received their basic and advanced flight training. It had several different kinds of aircraft stationed there, the BT-13, but BT means basic trainer. And for the advanced flight training, they had AT-6 aircraft for the future fighter pilots and AT-10 aircraft, twin engine aircraft for the future bomber pilots. Some of the Black cadets trained to be future fighter pilots, some future bomber pilots, but all of the instructors at Tuskegee Army Airfield for at least 2 years were white military personnel who were already pilots in the Air Force, in the Army Air Forces, I mean. Next slide, please. Tuskegee Army Airfield had 3 large hangars. And after Tuskegee Army Airfield closed in 1946, at the end, after World War II had ended, those hangars were moved to other places. They were moved One of them was moved to Montgomery's airport, one to the Clanton airport, one to the Troy airport. All of these are airports in central Alabama. But if you wanted to see what one of those hangars that was at Tuskegee Army Airfield looked like, you could just go to one of those airports and see it. Next slide, please. For most of World War II, Colonel Noel Parrish served as commander of Tuskegee Army Airfield. He was the head of the basic and advanced flying school there. Although Parrish was a white man from the South, most Tuskegee Airmen pilots remember him as a fair man who was truly interested in their success. Parrish was determined that Black pilots would be trained just as well as white pilots, would have all the same qualifications as the white pilots being trained at other bases. The Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated, an organization founded by Tuskegee Airmen veterans, created a Noel Parrish Award that they present to one of their members every year. And it's in honor of Colonel Noel Parrish. Next slide, please. There were a total of 44 classes that graduated from advanced flight training at Tuskegee Army Airfield. Almost 1,000 cadets completed the training from a total of about 2,000 who started it. So about half of the people who entered the flight training program, the primary, basic, and advanced, did not actually graduate from the advanced flight training. Training was demanding, but the pilots who completed the training were among the best in the Army Air Forces. Next slide, please. This is another picture of one of the classes. As I said, there were 44 classes altogether, and they varied in size. Some of them trained to be future fighter pilots, as I said, in single-engine aircraft, and some of them trained to be future bomber pilots in twin-engine aircraft. The first class had only 13 who actually started the primary flight phase, and of those 13, only 5 graduated. But later classes were larger, and some of the classes were much larger than that. Next slide, please. The first Black flying unit, the 99th Pursuit Squadron, was later redesignated the 99th Fighter Squadron. It was also the first Black flying unit to deploy and enter combat overseas. It went to North Africa in the spring of 1943. And when you think about it, if they started training in 1941, about a year later, 1942, about a year after the squadron started, was when they actually had the first pilots assigned to them, March of 1942. And then it took another year before the squadron was actually deployed overseas. It went first to North Africa in the spring of 1943. That year, later that year, it went to Sicily and the mainland of Italy, where it served in the 12th Air Force. Lieutenant Charles Hall was the first Tuskegee Airman to shoot down an enemy airplane. Notice the emblem of the unit. There are hints of what the number of the squadron is from the emblem. You can see there are 9 stars, and there are 9 segments around the ring on the outside of the emblem. So that's 9 stars, 9 segments, 99 for the 99th Fighter Squad. Next slide, please. The 99th Fighter Squadron flew P-40 airplanes, the same type of airplane that the Flying Tigers flew in China. While the P-40s of the 99th were new, they were not good for shooting down enemy airplanes. They were used mostly for protecting friendly forces on the ground and attacking enemy targets on the ground. At first, the Tuskegee Airmen had little opportunity to shoot down enemy aircraft. There was no Black fighter group overseas to which the 99th Fighter Squadron could be assigned. So at first, it was attached to various white fighter groups. And one of the commanders of one of those white fighter groups to which the 99th was attached tried to get them taken out of combat. And the recommendation went all the way up to the chain to the head of the Army Air Forces. And the War Department decided to investigate and compare the 99th Fighter Squadron with the other P-40 squadrons that were flying in the Mediterranean theater. And the results were that the 99th was flying just as well as the other P-40 units that were flying in that theater. The commander of the 99th, by the way, was Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., and I'll tell you more about him in a few minutes. Next slide, please. The first black fighter group, squadrons were assigned to groups and groups were assigned to wings during World War II. The first black fighter group was the 332nd Fighter Group, and it was activated at Tuskegee Army Airfield. Like other fighter groups, it had 3 assigned fighter squadrons. They were the 100th, 301st, and 302nd. At first, the 99th was not assigned to the 332nd Fighter Group because the 99th had already had a head start on the others. In the spring of 1943, when the 99th Fighter Squadron left Tuskegee Army Airfield to go overseas, the 332nd Fighter Group and its squadrons moved to Selfridge Field, Michigan for transition training in the kinds of fighters that would fly overseas, aircraft such as the P-40 or the P-39. The first commander of the 332nd Fighter Group was Colonel Robert Selway, a white officer. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., who had commanded the 99th Fighter Squadron overseas, returned to the United States to take command of the 332nd just before it deployed to Italy in early 1944. At first, the 332nd Fighter Group flew P-39 aircraft, and those aircraft, like the P-40s that the 99th was already flying in Italy, were not really designed to shoot down enemy airplanes. They weren't really designed to do that. They were designed more to hit enemy targets on the ground. So just like the 99th, the 332nd Fighter Group and its 3 squadrons did not really have much opportunity to shoot down many enemy aircraft during World War II at first, until their assignment changed. Note the emblem. It has a Black Panther spitting fire. The 332nd motto was Spitfire, as you see in the bottom there, but the group did not fly British Spitfire aircraft. Sometimes when I go around and I show this slide, people ask me that question. No, they never did fly British Spitfires. They might have thought they were going to fly Spitfires at one time, but they never did. Next slide, please. In the summer of 1944, the 99th Fighter Squadron was assigned to the 332nd Fighter Group in Italy so that all the black fighter squadrons would be assigned to the same black fighter group. That made the 332nd Fighter Group the only fighter group with 4 instead of 3 squadrons assigned. So it had more squadrons than the average fighter group in World War II. It had 4 instead of 3. The 332nd Fighter Group was reassigned from the 12th Air Force to the 15th Air Force at the same time. And that was also an important change because the primary duty of the 332nd Fighter Group was to escort 4-engine bombers, such as the B-17 you see in the picture, and also the B-24, a picture of which I'll show you in just a few minutes. Each bomber had a crew of 10 men. For the escort duty, the 332nd Fighter Group and its squadrons were assigned new aircraft types that could better engage enemy fighters. At first, they flew P-47 aircraft, and then they eventually switched to the P-51 Mustang. The next slide shows you what that looked like. The P-51 Mustang was probably the best Allied fighter aircraft in World War II. It was fast, it was maneuverable, and it had a long range. The 332nd Fighter Group had aircraft with tails painted red, as you see in the picture, for identification. The 15th Air Force had 21 bomber groups, 7 fighter groups to escort them. So there were often more bombers to escort than there were fighters to escort them. They had 21 bomber groups and only 7 fighter groups. 4 of the fighter groups flew P-51s like the one you see, and 3 of the fighter groups flew P-38s. Each of the groups had distinctively painted tails, so it wasn't just the Tuskegee Airmen who had tails with a distinctive color. The 52nd Fighter Group, for example, had yellow tails. The 31st Fighter Group had striped red tails, and the 325th Fighter Group had black and yellow checkerboard pattern tails. They were used so that the bombers that were being escorted would be able to know who was escorting them and could better identify which planes were friend or foe. Next slide, please. For the bomber escort missions, the 332nd Fighter Group flew for the 15th Air Force. Between early June 1944 and the end of April 1945, the group was stationed at Ramatelli Airfield near the Adriatic Sea on the eastern coast of central Italy. Other groups were stationed nearby. You can see in this slide the location of some of those groups as Madna Airfield, 52nd Fighter Group, Yellowtails. I don't know how well you can see it in the picture, but Ramatelli Airfield for the 332nd Fighter Group is to the right. And you can see that the shore of the Adriatic Sea is up near the top of the picture. Next slide, please. Sometimes the Tuskegee Airmen's 332nd Fighter Group escorted B-17 flying fortresses like you saw in the previous, another picture. Sometimes it escorted B-24 Liberators like this. Both bomber types had similar crew sizes and bomb loads, but the B-17 could fly higher and was more survivable if it was hit, while the B-24 could fly slightly faster and farther. Incidentally, my own father was a B-24 bomber pilot in World War II. He flew a plane like this. Next slide, please. The most famous of the Tuskegee Airmen bomber escort missions was the one to Berlin, the German capital, on March 24th, 1945. Not only was it the only 15th Air Force mission to Berlin, because most of the missions against Berlin were by the 8th Air Force, which was based in England, but the only 15th Air Force, or the first 15th Air Force mission to Berlin was March 24th, 1945. And it was also the only one, the longest mission that the 15th Air Force flew. During that mission, they encountered, among other enemy aircraft, German jets like these Me-262s. The jets could fly as much as 100 miles per hour faster than the P-51s. But on March 24, 1945, 3 Tuskegee Airmen each shot down one of those Me-262s. Next slide, please. The most famous Tuskegee Airman of all was Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., and I've already mentioned his name once. He was the son of the first Black general of the Army, and I think you could tell from his name that his father was Benjamin O. Davis, Sr. He attended West Point. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. attended West Point, but not his father. Davis was in the first class of Black military pilots, and he served as commander of the 99th Fighter Squadron, then as commander of the 332nd Fighter Group. He eventually became commander also of the 477th Bombardment Group, which was also a Tuskegee Airmen organization. Later, Benjamin O. Davis Jr. became the first Black general in the United States Air Force. In fact, the first 3 Black generals in the Air Force were all Tuskegee Airmen. Next slide, please. Pilots of the 99th Fighter Squadron and other squadrons of the 332nd Fighter Group shot down, as you can see in the slide, a total of 112 enemy aircraft. That includes not only the ones shot down by the 99th Fighter Squadron before the 332nd Fighter Group went overseas, but also after, including the 332nd Fighter Group and its other squadrons. None of the Tuskegee Airmen had at least 5 aerial victory credits, so there were no aces, but 3 of the Tuskegee Airmen shot down 4 enemy airplanes, and 4 of the Tuskegee Airmen shot down 3 enemy airplanes in one day. Next slide, please. The Tuskegee Airmen flew 312 missions for the 15th Air Force from early June 1944 through the end of April 1945. 179 of these were bomber escort missions. Tuskegee Airmen escorted bombers were shot down on only 7 of those missions. But a total of 27 bombers under Tuskegee Airmen escort were shot down by enemy airplanes. The average number of bombers shot down while under the escort of one of the other fighter groups was 46. The Tuskegee Airmen lost significantly fewer bombers than the other groups, partly because they had a reputation for staying with the bombers as they were ordered, not going after enemy aircraft if those enemy aircraft were not threatening the bombers. The Tuskegee Airmen did not want to go chasing after enemy airplanes and leave the bombers unprotected. Next slide, please. One of the Tuskegee Airmen, or 32 of the Tuskegee Airmen, became prisoners of war in Nazi Germany, and one of them was Alexander Jefferson, Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Jefferson eventually. Alexander Jefferson is still living. He lives in Detroit, Michigan. He's about, I think he just turned 100 years old this year. And he's written an autobiography called Red Tail Capture, Red Tail Free, an image of which you see on the slide. Next slide, please. Dr. Harold Brown is another Tuskegee Airman who was shot down and became a prisoner of war. And he also wrote his autobiography. It's called Keep Your Airspeed Up. And he wrote that in collaboration with his wife. He is also living, and he is still going around and talking about his experiences in World War II. It's a very interesting story. And he's come to Maxwell Air Force Base. I've met him and Alexander Jefferson, and they have very inspiring stories to tell. Next slide, please. The Tuskegee Airmen bomber pilots were assigned to the 477th Bombardment Group, but it never left the United States to take part in combat. It was still training for operations in the Pacific Theater when the war ended. The 477th Bombardment Group trained at Selfridge Field, Michigan, Godman Field, Kentucky, and Freeman Field, Indiana. While most of the members of the 477th were Black, and many of them, of course, were pilots, when they got their wings, they got their commissions as second lieutenants, most of them. Second lieutenants or flight officers. And so they were officers, but there was a group of white officers that was in charge of the 477th Bombardment Group. So there were white officers and Black officers. And the commander of the 477th Bombardment Group, who had been an earlier white commander of the 332nd Fighter Group before it went overseas, was Colonel Robert Selway. He was a segregationist, and he wanted to keep segregation on the bases where he was commander of the 477th. At Selfridge, there were problems. When they went to Godman Field, Kentucky, there weren't as many problems because there was one officers club on the base, but the white officers went next door to Fort Knox. And then when they went to Freeman Field, when the 477th was reassigned to Freeman Field, Indiana, there was not a Fort Knox next door. So the commander, Colonel Robert Selway, decided to have two officers clubs, one for whites and one for Blacks. It led to a lot of controversy. The Black officers wanted to go to the white officers club, and they resisted the policy of Colonel Selway. An incident developed in April of 1945 called the Freeman Field Mutiny, and over 100 of those Black officers were arrested. Ultimately, they were exonerated, but the solution to the problem months later was to reassign all the white officers of the 477th Bombardment Group to other units. And the 477th, like the 332nd earlier, became an all-Black organization. Notice the emblem of the 477th. It has 4 bombs and 2 lines of 50 caliber machine gun bullets. They wanted people to know they were the 477th, the 4 bombs and the 2 groups of 7, 477. You could see the slogan, the motto of the group too: our hearts with our country, our eyes on the target. Next slide, please. The 477th Bombardment Group flew B-25 twin-engine bombers similar to those flown by the Doolittle Raiders. The bombers had 5-man crews. They had pilots, co-pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and a radio operator gunner. All of those positions, except for the radio operator gunner, were officer slots. So there were a lot of officers in the 477th Bombardment Group. By the time the 477th Bombardment Group was fully trained to go into combat overseas, World War II had ended. Next slide, please. This is a picture of Colonel Robert Selway with the Mills Brothers. I don't know how many of you are old enough to remember the Mills Brothers, but they used to be a popular singing group on the radio. Colonel Robert Selway was the white commander of the 332nd Fighter Group before Benjamin O. Davis Jr. became the commander of that group, and he later became commander of the 477th Bombardment Group. As I told you a little earlier, he was a segregationist, unlike Colonel Noel Parrish. Colonel Noel Parrish at Tuskegee Army Airfield arranged for the facilities on Tuskegee Army Airfield to be integrated, but Robert Selway was a segregationist. And so in history, Noel Parrish has come down in history as a hero of the Tuskegee Airmen, and Robert Selway is a villain. Next slide, please. This is one of my favorite pictures of the Tuskegee Airmen. The first Black general in the US Army was Benjamin O. Davis Sr. The first Black general in the US Air Force was Benjamin O. Davis Jr. Here's a photograph of them together when then Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr., the commander of the 332nd Fighter Group at the time, received his Distinguished Flying Cross at Ramitelli Airfield in Italy in the summer of 1944. The citation mentioned his leading his group so successfully on a mission on June 9th that only a few bombers were lost. Next slide, please. The first Black four-star general in the Air Force, in fact, in any of the services, was also a Tuskegee Airman. He was General Daniel Chappie James. He had been assigned to the 477th Bombardment Group during World War II, and then later he flew fighter aircraft in Korea and Vietnam. General James was 6 feet 4 inches tall. He was reassigned from fighters to bombers during World War II, partly because of his size. Next slide, please. You may recognize the guy on the left. Charles McGee is another Tuskegee Airman, famous Tuskegee Airman, whom I knew personally. He flew fighters in 3 wars, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. He flew a total of 409 combat missions, more than any other Tuskegee Airman, but not more than any other Air Force pilot who flew in those 3 wars. Before he died at the age of 102 earlier this year, he was promoted to the honorary rank of Brigadier General. Next slide, please. President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9981 in 1948. The order mandated the end of segregation in the armed forces of the United States. The Air Force had already begun to integrate, partly because of the Tuskegee Airmen had proved that there was no good reason to keep the races separate. Blacks could fly and fight as well as whites. In 1949, the Tuskegee Airmen units were inactivated and their personnel were reassigned to formerly all-white units to implement the provisions of Executive Order 9981. There's only 2 more slides that I'd like to speak about, and then because of the time factor, I think I could skip the last part of the slides about the top 10 false claims, but I want to talk about 2 more slides during the time I have. Next slide, please. In March 2007, President George W. Bush unveiled a Congressional Gold Medal that Congress authorized to be minted to honor the Tuskegee Airmen collectively. The medal is at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. At the ceremony, many of the Tuskegee Airmen were given bronze replicas of the medal, but there's only one actual gold medal that honors the Tuskegee Airmen, and that's at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. today. Next slide, please. Okay. I guess the book slide is at the very end. If you just skip down the 10 false claims, we can go over them very, very quickly. I'll just read them as we go, if that's all right with everybody. Okay, that the Tuskegee Airmen were inferior, we know they were not because of some of the things I've already mentioned. Next slide, please. That no bomber under Tuskegee Airmen escort was shot down by enemy aircraft is also false. I've already mentioned that 27 bombers under their escort were shot down by enemy airplanes, but that was better than the other groups, which lost an average of 46. Next slide, please. Lee Archer was a Tuskegee Airman who shot down 4 enemy aircraft, 1 on one day and 3 on another day, but he was not an ace as some claimed later in the war or after the war. Next slide, please. Roscoe Brown was one of the 3 Tuskegee Airmen who shot down German jets, but he was not the first American pilot to shoot down a German jet, as some people have claimed. Next slide, please. The Tuskegee Airmen attacked a warship in June of 1944, but the warship, according to naval records, did not actually sink that day. It was put out of operation for the rest of the war, so it might as well have sunk, but it was not scuttled until the next year. Next slide, please. I've mentioned Brigadier General Charles McGee flew 409 combat missions. That wasn't higher than the number of combat missions for any fighter pilot in those 3 wars, but it might have been the 3rd highest. There were 2 other pilots that had more than 409 combat missions. Next slide, please. Sometimes you hear that Eleanor Roosevelt, after she flew with Charles Anderson at Tuskegee, went back and convinced her husband to train black military pilots, and that's not true because the 99th Fighter Squadron, 99th Pursuit Squadron at the time, had already been activated. Next slide, please. That the Tuskegee Airmen were the only fighter escort group. They were not the only fighter escort group on the Berlin mission. As you see in some movies, it looks like they're the only fighter escort group that showed up that day, but they were not. Next slide, please. And that the Tuskegee Airmen outperformed all the other fighter groups. It depends on what you look at. They lost fewer bombers, but they also shot down fewer enemy aircraft. So it depends on what you look at. Their main job was to bring the bombers back safely, and they did that. Next slide, please. And that the Tuskegee Airmen alone won the 1949 Air Force gunnery meet. There was an Air Force gunnery meet in 1949, but it had 2 categories, one jet category and a propeller aircraft category. The categories did not compete against each other. There was a different number of events in each category, different number of maximum possible number of points. So the 4th Fighter Group won the jet aircraft category, and the 332nd Fighter Group won the propeller aircraft category. And sometimes you hear a story about the trophy was hidden to obscure the achievement of the winning group, but there was no deliberate effort to hide the achievement of either of the groups that won in 1949. Next slide, please. And these are 2 of the books I've written about the Tuskegee Airmen. The one on the left, the Tuskegee Airmen Chronology, is a paperback. And the one on the right is a hardback, the Tuskegee Airmen and Illustrated History, which contains a version of the Tuskegee Airmen Chronology, a shorter version, but it was co-authored by me and Joseph Caver and Jerome Ennals, who were working at the Air Force Historical Research Agency at the time as archivists. So I'd be glad to answer any questions later on, but that's all I wanted to say right now about the slides. And thank you, Sedale, for helping me show those slides. I appreciate it.
And thank you. This was very, very informative and really, really interesting. We did have a couple of questions that came through, so I would love to get your thoughts just before we get to the rest of the day. The first being, you kind of did a really good job, especially in the last 10 slides, but even beforehand, of starting to correct the record for people. Is there some place where there's kind of an agreed upon, accurate depiction of the Tuskegee Airmen, rather than kind of trying to find different, pieces wherever you can?
Well, I would recommend that book on the left, the Tuskegee Airmen Chronology, because that's the true story. Everything in there is what I've researched. It puts all that information in chronological form, and in the process, it says what did happen, and that kind of refutes what did not happen. But there is another book that I'm working on now. Well, it's actually finished. New South Books of Montgomery, Alabama is supposed to be publishing a new book of mine in the spring of this year called Misconceptions About the Tuskegee Airmen. And it addresses 55 false claims about Tuskegee Airmen history. Just over the course of the years, when I was researching the Tuskegee Airmen, I came across a lot of misconceptions, and I wanted to correct those. But if
That's
I had to
awesome.
recommend one source, I would say that Tuskegee Airmen chronology.
Yeah, no, that's great. If you haven't, and we can chat via email, maybe links to this book and your upcoming book. I think we'd love to add that to some of the follow-up material so that people can
New
reference it.
South Books, and it's on Amazon too.
Nice. Okay. We can find those. And then one more for you. When you think about the desegregation of armed forces, um, what was the career path like for Black pilots, in those days? And then maybe if you have a thought on how that, how that was dramatically different than maybe what's happening today.
Well, that's a good question. The number of Black pilots who trained as Tuskegee Airmen was higher than the number of Black pilots in the Air Force today, but the percentage was lower. In World War II, the percentage of Black pilots was about half of 1%. The percentage of Black pilots in the Air Force today is about 2%. It's still very low, but 2% is better than half of a percent, which is what it was in World War II. So if you look at absolute numbers, there were more Black pilots then. But if you look at percentage of the total number of pilots in the Air Force, then it's greater now than it was then. It's still a long way to go. I should mention too that a lot of the Tuskegee Airmen who were pilots at the end of World War II wanted to continue to fly. And because they didn't have too much opportunity to do that in civilian life, because many civilian airlines didn't hire Black pilots, partly because they didn't fly transport type aircraft. But many of them decided if they wanted to continue to fly, they would stay in the service, stay in the Air Force. And many of them did. That's why so many of them, like Chappie James and Charles McGee, flew in Korea and Vietnam. So there were many Tuskegee Airmen who flew not only in World War II, but also in Korea and Vietnam.
Wow, that's really interesting, especially when you consider, how would someone even create a career for themselves if becoming a civilian almost means you have less of a chance to be a pilot. And maybe one more. I think we've got a couple of minutes, and I would say this is my personal question. I'm curious because I read recently that Delta Airlines was working with a historically Black college, Hampton University, for a sort of training program to start to increase the number of Black pilots. And I wonder if you have other thoughts on how we can start to make some inroads there, because I think, like it sounds like there's some progress. Obviously, the ability to even become a Black pilot exists now in a way that it didn't. But are there other things that people may take from your work to make
Yes,
some progress?
there's several private efforts to try to increase the number of Black pilots who train not only as military pilots, but also as civilian pilots. But the Air Force has for many years now been trying to increase the number of African Americans who become pilots in the Air Force. And there's a lot of encouragement of that. The current Secretary of the Air Force, the current Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Charles Brown, is an African American. The current head, I believe, of the Air Force Academy is an African American. So the Air Force is trying to increase the number of Black pilots in the Air Force, and there's no legal obstacles to prevent Blacks from being pilots in the Air Force. I don't want to leave that impression. Just because there's only 2% of Air Force pilots that are Black today doesn't mean there's a deliberate attempt to keep the number low.
Sure.
But there are efforts to encourage more African Americans to go into that field.
Great. Well, thank you again. And you can see the chat. There's lots of wonderful presentation. Thank yous. So lots of people got a lot out of it. So we really appreciate you taking the time and going through this with us.
Well, you're very welcome. I appreciate the opportunity to share what I've learned.
Yeah, thank you. All right, and with that, we're gonna transition now. Now that we've got some context, we understand the history. We'll start to transition into the challenge itself. And so I'll bring up Tim and Ethan. I believe Lou's joined us as well. I know Alan, may come in and bring in comments as well, but want to bring in the group to kind of start to look at some of the different visuals that we've seen through the challenge and what we thought of it. And I believe you guys have participants as well that may be available to chat about it.
Yeah, we do. Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. So I'm Tim Blaisdell. Me and Ethan and Lou and one other, Abe. Abe's not on right now, but we lead the Veterans Advocacy User Group. And Alan reached out to us originally to take part in this challenge, and then kind of take the lead in the actual challenge review. So I guess I guess I'll just go into going over some, and just because I'm leading it, and I can show my own first. 1 second. All right. Okay. Everyone see that?
Yes.
Yep.
All right. So this is so when I was doing this, I always enjoyed looking back at the newspapers of the day in World War II, and this the headlines that they have are, exclamation marks and kind of I don't know, but so I have the Red Tails, fight and sacrifice. So the story I wanted to kind of portray is that these guys fought for us, they died for us, they sacrificed a lot to fight for a country that really didn't treat them as equals. So I wanted to get that out, that message out there. Like, so I try to be like a newspaper from the day. And so here I have, I'm not exactly sure, and I apologize, who these gentlemen are and what unit, but it looks like a P-40 behind them. And then I have the timeline here. If you hover over it, it'll give you more details about what happened. I won't go through it, but you can find this on Tableau Public just by searching Tuskegee Airmen and some of the other ones that we'll show. Then I have the home state, how many came from your home state. And if you hover over that, it gives you the number. And this is a picture of Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the commander of the 99th Pursuit Squadron. And because I like airplanes myself, as you can tell by my background, and I work for the FAA, I have the, I think these are called spotter cards, or just spotter images of all the planes that they used, and indicated as best as I could what time from the years. I forgot that the expert of the Tuskegee Airmen were going to be on here, so I'm a little nervous showing the information. I don't want to portray things that are not exactly true, but please, doctor, if you see anything that's not true,
With just one correction, I noticed that you had Captain Benjamin O. Davis Jr. By that time, he was Colonel.
Oh, he was Colonel. Okay.
Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr. He was a Colonel by the time he was head of the 99th overseas, partly because he was a West Point graduate.
Okay. I think
West Point graduates had a faster promotion table schedule than others.
That makes sense. I think I put captain because I saw a picture and he was captain in that picture, and I didn't fact check well enough. So then I have here comparing the P-51 groups. And okay, good, great. Comparing the P-51 groups of the 15th Air Force, and I did pose a question down here, and I wasn't sure of that, but I kind of made an assumption that they stuck to the mission by not downing more aircraft than anybody, but saving more bombers. And I'm glad, Doctor, that you validated that assumption. Sure. So here I have the individual victories, and if you, hopefully this works. I'm not going to do it just because I don't want the internet to hiccup, but if you click on it, whoever does have a profile, it will lead to their profile. So I have the individual victories here. their combat mission or their tallies here. So as we pointed out, or in the presentation, there was one destroyer including in these boats and barges. So that actually could be 41, because I don't know if that was included. And then for those killed or missing in action, I displayed a waffle chart just to kind of put, remind you that these are people, just not numbers, and the facts here as you hover over it. And then the prisoners of war here with a viz in the tooltip that filters out the one visual that to show all the information on there, including Yugoslavia and everything like that. So so that's mine. And does anyone have any questions on it, or I would like some constructive feedback or anything like that?
Looks excellent to me.
Thank you.
I love the
Tim, I
design.
love the design, that newspaper look and feel. I thought that was really cool.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, it took me a long time to find the background to it, actually, to find a good one without actual words on it. Okay. All right. Thank you for the feedback. And we have a few people online. Let me see if I can get, let's see. We have Chris Arago. Chris, I think we can unmute you, and if you want to come on camera, you can talk about yours, and I'll skip to it. Are you on? I'll give you a second. Do we know if we unmuted him?
He is just jumping over to panelists now. I think he just joined.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yep. Hey, Chris, what's up?
Oh yeah, I just have to rejoin as a panelist.
Yeah.
Hi everyone. Yeah, so that's fine.
There you go.
All right. So I'm trying to get back into Tableau. I can try to keep it a little bit, at least on the visual side, for the data and the data that we got. It kept it pretty simple. So left hand section, just some numbers on missing in action, killed in action, prisoners of war. Did a Haulman record map with a data layer from an ArcGIS data layer. I found a free web layer that kind of had a different background that I liked. And then just did some unit roster. On the right hand side, I was playing around with the ranks and trying to display that. It's pretty small. It was something that probably I could have done a little bit better. After some feedback from some folks, put a couple of filters, 2 or 3, the last name, killed in action, prisoner of war, so that you're able to kind of filter the list out quickly. The main thing I focused on was just trying to learn as much as I could, take the challenge as a way to learn more about the Tuskegee Airmen. So, the images in the back, the left-hand jacket, bomber jacket that came from the Rise Above website. The middle picture is from, I believe I got it from the National Archives. At least I saw it in the National Archives, but I could have got it from another archive site. It was, the top said "Keep Us Flying," and the bottom there was a big, all caps said, "Buy war bonds." So it was a poster that was used to have Americans buy more war bonds. And then the right hand picture is a cartoon that was drawn about the 99th Pursuit Squadron. You just hit the right arrow on the bottom right. And then I think on this page, yeah, if you just close out that little banner thing,
Oh, sorry.
yeah, it just pops up. So the second page, I just try to take, one event that happens that they were involved in that kind of crystallizes, what, some of the things that they were doing, Tuskegee Airmen. So Dr. Haulman, you'll notice that quote, but really looking at that March 24th, 1945 day. So basically, as far as I can tell, and you can kind of correct me if I'm wrong, but the bombers were going in to knock out the Daimler-Benz engine factory in Berlin, and that factory had been repurposed to make Panzer tanks, I think, or just German tanks for this, to keep it quick. But basically, that factory was pumping out tanks, and at the time, the military was trying to really knock out Germany's ability to, make these tanks, because they figured if they could knock out this factory, it would shorten the war. So this is a big target that they wanted to hit. They sent in the bombers. About, the Tuskegee Airmen are escorting the bombers. They get there to a drop-off point or handoff point, and who they're supposed to be handing it off to doesn't show up. So they get to their drop-off point. There's nobody there to escort the bombers to Berlin to do this very important mission. And they know they don't have enough fuel possibly to get it all the way back to Ramitelli from Berlin. And do the whole escort to Berlin and then double back and go all the way to Italy. But with propeller planes, right? With prop engine planes. They do it anyway. They take on that risk. And they also know that there's German jets that are going to be possibly coming after them. So I found a video from Dr. Roscoe Brown, where he kind of described what happened that day, to kind of put this all together in one visual. And basically, the data that you see up top on the picture, that's from the Theater History of Operation Reports, or Thor. It's a data set that kind of details air war bombing missions for the US going back to World War I. They had records for March 24th, 1945 in Berlin. And then that picture is actually from the National Archives, and that's an aerial photo of when they bombed Berlin. So that's them hitting, the bombers hitting that factory on that day. So it just goes to show kind of the heroics of that day and what they were asked to do and what they did.
That's awesome.
And then other than that, I just have a sources page where I just kind of try to list out the sources.
Cool.
That's it.
That's awesome, Chris. I like the colors on the first page, definitely, and the illustrations that you use in the video. That's pretty cool. I actually didn't notice that the second page until you mentioned it. That's cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, Chris, a lot of great work here. This is fantastic.
All right.
My only piece of feedback that I would give, you have a lot of really good elements, especially here on this first page, but I would almost like reorganize these elements to tell the story in a more cohesive kind of timeline manner. So maybe start off with like the home of record, then the unit roster, then the missing in action. It's just kind of how it would fall in. My only other piece of feedback would be like that story that's on that second page is so vibrant and like good. But on your first page, it's just that little arrow as far as like getting people over there.
Yeah.
Maybe making that call out like a little bit brighter, maybe giving them some context on what's on the other end of it.
Okay.
But man, this is fantastic. I love it.
Thank you.
Great work.
Very cool. Nicole, did you want to do yours?
Yeah, sure.
Right. Second.
So I'll just start talking about what I was trying to accomplish here. Kind of similar to what Timothy was saying. I was hoping to increase the overall awareness of the history of the Tuskegee Airmen who, as Timothy said, fought for our country, despite the fact that we did not treat Black people very well historically, even through to today. We're still working on this, and it's amazing to me. But so I wanted to show their tradition of excellence despite the circumstances. And I submitted this as part of both this challenge and the Du Bois challenge. So I used the colors from the Du Bois style guide that was provided by Alan. And I love the vibrancy of Du Bois's visualization so much. So this was really fun to do. There's up at the top right, there's a tree map that just kind of compares the number of missions, victories, number of squadrons. I now have some more context for that after hearing Dr. Haulman. I might do something a little different there. The bar chart shows in black the number of missions, but in red the number of bomber escort missions specifically. In red, it's the number of bombers lost to enemy aircraft. As you can see, the Red Tails, the 332nd Fighter Group, lost fewer than half of the next most successful group, the 31st. Then I rarely use a pie chart, but I was like, bright colors, why not throw in a pie chart too? Partly to show that the Red Tails had fewer bombers shot down when they were escorting them than these other groups. So just again, reinforcing the idea of their tradition of excellence. And the other metrics that are displayed on the right in the squares, in the average number of bombers lost per mission, average number of enemy aircraft shot down per mission, lower is better. And they have bested their counterparts in those as well. The top one, again, after hearing Dr. Haulman, is maybe not a fair comparison because their job wasn't to shoot down aircraft necessarily. Yeah, so just a tiny bit of context. My mom was a flight attendant. So she taught me everything aviation that she could get in front of me when I was growing up. And I first heard of the Tuskegee Airmen when I was probably like 6 or 7 years old. That's what I can remember. And I remember talking about it with a friend and they had no idea what I was talking about because it's a part of history that it wasn't taught in a college level American history course that I took, wasn't taught in high school. I'm not sure about now, it's been a while. Hopefully they're getting more recognition these days. But anyway, I loved the challenge. Just the data set really resonates for me because of my mom's connection with aviation and also just because I love this story. Yeah, and I could just go on and on, but I really, really enjoy. Oh, this is my first visit of the day too, which was really fun.
I was going to say that. I was going to toot your horn. So, and also I was just going to say that when you said that it wasn't their job to shoot down planes, but it was to protect the bombers. That's what Dr. Haulman was actually saying, is that they were better about keeping with that mission to protect the bombers, because a lot of pilots went off to score aerial victories and they didn't stay with the bombers, and that's why more bombers.
So I didn't misunderstand.
You did not.
So
did not.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Then lower is better in all
Yes.
of those metrics. I don't need to change that visual.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah. So
I could maybe add a little annotation about it, so it would be a little clearer.
Yeah.
Cool. If I could just add a statement, I think it's a little bit misleading to say that their mission wasn't to shoot down enemy airplanes.
Oh, okay.
Their mission was to shoot down enemy airplanes that were directly threatening the bombers, not to go chasing after them and leave the bombers unprotected.
Yep.
So it was protective rather than an offensive, or defensive rather than offensive.
Right. It was to keep the enemy fighters that were attacking the bombers. They were trying to shoot them down, but they weren't trying to build up their scores of aerial victories by leaving the bombers unprotected.
Gotcha.
Oh, very
Thank
good.
you. I appreciate
You're
the clarification. It helps me understand a little bit better.
And
Very good.
Nicole, congrats on Viz of the Day with this.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Thanks.
Fantastic Viz. I love it.
Thank you.
One
Thanks.
of the things that I love the most about it, some people always kind of forget like the importance of even just the fonts, but I love the font that you chose here. It kind of has that like typewriter feel to it.
Mhm.
That's
yeah,
what I was
love that.
hoping for. And I was
Yeah.
like, you know how Tableau Public is with the fonts. I was like, please let
Yeah,
this be okay.
Originally, I had downloaded this cool like old newspaper font, and I was like, "Oh, this looks so cool!" And then I uploaded it to the Tableau Public, and it did not show. I'm like, "Ah, thanks." So,
Yeah.
very cool.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
We have one, or at least one other person, attendee, Connie Zhang. If Alyssa, I sent you a direct message. Can you make her a panelist so she can go through hers?
Yes, just did.
Okay, cool. And sorry, I'm on a. Okay, 1 second.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Perfect. Okay. Zoom's always a little iffy with my computer, so I always get a little nervous. But thanks again, everyone, for having me here today. And it's really great to hear about the Tuskegee Airmen from an expert Air Force historian like Dr. Haulman. So thank you again. So I was inspired to create this dashboard because it explores minority American heroes who I think we still have a lot to learn from. And I really would like to echo Tim's sentiment that despite their achievements and sacrifices when they came home, it was to a country that was still full of racial injustice. So I really think that's really important to the story. So the leadership at the Veterans Advocacy TUG did a fantastic job at really encouraging us to take the time to learn more about the Tuskegee Airmen, learn about their story and legacy, and think about how we wanted to incorporate that into the dashboard. And I think, as Dr. Haulman and a few of the other participants noted, a lot of the sources are kind of scattered, and it was kind of difficult to find kind of one source of information that just had 100% confirmed truths. But I did the best that we could here. So if there's any errors, Dr. Haulman, please correct me. So if we look at this dashboard in business intelligence, generally there's kind of a saying that less is usually more, and clearly I used a lot of text. But in this context, I think it is important to include that here because there's just so much history and so much of a story to tell with this. To balance this out, I tried to keep my graphs and charts pretty simple. So the for example, like the donut charts and the tree maps, I try to highlight just one key takeaway per graph. And I think this combined with the text, I think they're able to paint a better picture of the Angels' legacy than just a viz or a text alone. So everyone else who participated in this did too. So thank you very much for organizing this. And if you have any questions about dashboards, please let me know. I'm happy to talk about it in a little more detail, but I also want to be respectful of the timeline and keep my description a little short.
This is really great. So it's just a different way of displaying the data. It's, I don't know, it's more of a report rather than a dashboard, which I like. But I really like the message that you're trying to portray. It's very good.
It looks good. It reflects a lot of effort, but just one correction I would like to make. If you go down to the beginning a little bit.
Up here?
You're right. See, it says 1,003 total airmen. I think you're counting the pilots and not the total Tuskegee Airmen. One thing I didn't mention is that most of the Tuskegee Airmen, most of the members of the Tuskegee Airmen units were on the ground. They weren't pilots. If you look at the total number of pilots, it was approximately 1,000. But if you look at the total number of Tuskegee Airmen, it was more than 14,000. So I was a little misleading when I did my presentation because I was focusing on the pilots. But I would just change that to, instead of total airmen, total pilots.
Mm-hmm.
Tuskegee Airmen pilots.
Very good note.
Yeah.
Very good note. Thank you, Dr. Haulman.
You're welcome.
I like that you incorporated the portion of rank, the ratio of of ranks, so we could see. I'm curious as to how that compares to the Army Air Force as a whole at the time.
Thank you.
Yeah, Connie, I love it. This is great. I like the way it flows. It reminds me of Tim's kind of that newspaper style, very informative, with these elements kind of backing up what you're saying in the text. Great work. Looks fantastic.
I like the font too. Like the bold.
Certainly.
Yeah.
Thank you. My font also got distorted, so I think it was good to know that I wasn't the only one that this happened to.
Yeah.
But it seemed like it all worked out in the end. So thank you again, everyone, for your kind words.
Sure.
Thank you.
Very good. Okay, Ethan, I know you had some that you wanted to point out.
Yeah, I'll take the screen. And just for the sake of time, I'm going to go through these a little bit quick.
Yeah, we have 15 minutes, so a few minutes on each one. And I think I saw in the chat that there is at least one other person that would like to share his.
Yeah, so I wanted to point out just a few others that we didn't mention. One is from Michelle Freeman. I love this viz. I thought it was really cool. It caught my eye when I saw it. But I like this like incorporation of size with the stars as well as color. I thought that was really interesting. She's also linked to the Rise Above site. So if you select on any of these, it will filter down to, the correct
That was cool.
bio from their site, which I thought was really interesting. It was a really cool take on it. The others, Adam just reached out in the chat, so I want to share his as well. But this one, it looks incredible. There's a lot of really good information here. I really like this use of the area chart as I was looking through it. Also, this, we kind of tend to forget about our good old analytics pane, but we have this distribution here with that kind of 95% confidence interval through the average. Thought that was an interesting way to incorporate that in there. Let's see. Sorry, this thing at the top is blocking me. This one caught my eye on Twitter. It's not built in Tableau. My understanding is there's another group called Tidy Tuesday that uses R and some R packages to create data visualization. I absolutely love this one. I thought it was really cool. They have kind of all the fighter jets for all the pilots, sized by how many enemy aircraft that they downed, so you can kind of see them. It almost looks like they're flying at different altitudes, which I found very cool. Another piece that I really enjoyed in the background, this is actually the airfield at Tuskegee, excuse me. So I thought that was really cool, just very light in the background. Interesting way to put that in there. Let's see, there was one other. This one came over this morning and I just had to share it. I mean, this is such a cool, incredible viz.
Yeah.
Very beautiful, well done. And let's see, the author of that, go ahead.
I was going to say, he goes by Demola.
Demola? Okay.
Yeah.
This is fantastic. Thank you for
Is
that.
he on?
I would not have done that justice.
Yeah.
No, I don't think he's not on right now.
Okay.
I don't think he is. Are you on? Let me see.
Okay.
Yes, so much encoded in the circular graph too. It's so well thought out.
Each band is an airman, I believe.
Yeah,
I
think so.
Yeah, it's very cool. Very interesting viz. I love this one.
Yeah, I like the fact that it's like a turbine. I'm glad I interpreted that correctly.
Yeah, that's interesting. That is cool. Those were the ones that I wanted to quickly preview. Also, Tim and I, we just want to say thank you to everybody in the community that participated. Such a fantastic challenge. I absolutely love these. It was really fun to see them pop up on Twitter or, cruise through Tableau Public and see them pop up. We also want to thank Dr. Haulman for joining us and giving us that extremely well done presentation. So much good stuff covered in a very short amount of time. Thank you so much, Dr. Haulman.
You're very welcome.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
Yeah.
Also, we, through the Veterans Advocacy Tableau user group, we kind of have a tradition, military tradition that we like to live up on. We have a challenge coin, military challenge coin that we got produced for the TUG. And as a thank you, Dr. Haulman and Alan specifically, we wanted to present you guys with our challenge coin. So we'll be reaching out for a good address to send these to. We also are going to be sending these to several participants that participated. We've called out some of those participants in this panel. So we'll be reaching out probably on LinkedIn for a good address to send these to.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah. I also just want to thank CAF Red Tails, that organization that helped us get the, provided the data for us. And that's how we met Dr. Haulman. So
I wanted to ask about that actually. So we can, are we organizing a way to present this to the CAF? And maybe they can, they can embed it in a website or something.
Yeah, we can reach out. We can reach out in the coming days. Like maybe, after this, I can reach out to the marketing person over there and see if that's possible.
Okay, great. And if anyone's interested, I'm going to do a shameless plug here. But I just put the link into the our Veterans Advocacy Tableau user group. Doesn't really roll off the tongue, but you can join right there, and you'll get all the all of our emails and our event updates and things if you're interested in doing more veteran centric visualizations. We also help out nonprofit veterans groups and try to get their data and give them a dashboard to use on their websites.
Yeah. So others may have this question. Do you need to be a veteran to participate in
No. And thank you for originally it was called the Veterans Tableau user group, but I would have to explain more that it's actually for advocacies too, or advocates. So, family members, friends, anyone who loves veterans, or anyone who wants to help out the veteran community is absolutely welcome to join.
Yeah, I was gonna shout you all out. They're a very fun group. I hung out with them a couple of times.
We're fun and funny.
Yes, they are. And I'm not a veteran, but I have family members who are, and I'm an advocate, so it made me feel welcome.
Thank you. I think that's all we have to show, unless anybody else wants to go over anything.
No, this was awesome. I hope everyone got something out of it. Thanks again. I think I would also thank, though my thank you is probably not as cool as a challenge coin, but Alan, I know, has been doing this work for a couple of years now and had a really awesome challenge last year and continued that on with the boys challenge, is now expanded to this challenge. And so I appreciate the Veterans Advocacy Tug, but also Alan and that team for bringing us all together, because we've created some really cool events. So thank you both.
Yeah, and I encourage
this was a lot of fun.
I encourage everyone. I know we're not going to probably be like spotlighting in this heavily, but if people still want to, contribute to the Tuskegee Airmen Challenge, we definitely encourage you all to still do that.
Thank you. Thank you for doing the challenge. I thought it was so fun.
Awesome. And thanks to thanks to Nicole and Chris and Connie. I'm terrible with names, but I believe her name was Connie, who did the other visit. All the participants that came up and explained their visits. That was a really cool way to showcase all the cool work you guys were doing. But other than that, I think we're all set. Thanks again, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your days, nights, and we'll see you at another event.
All right.
Thank you very much, Sedale. Thank you for showing my slides.
Yeah, thank you,
Dr.
Doctor.
Haulman.
Thanks, Dr. Haulman.
Thank you all.
You're very welcome.
Bye. Nice meeting you.